The rain had been falling on Ashford Minster for 3 days without pause when Hercule Poirot arrived, and it showed no intention of stopping for a fourth. It was the kind of rain that the English countryside produces in March, with the specific hostility of a climate that has endured a mild winter and is now making up for it, a fine, dense, persistent rain that did not fall so much as occupy the air, that made the churchyard grass a deep, unreal green, and turned the gravel paths to grey rivers, and collected in the carved hollows of the oldest headstones, as though trying to read them from the inside. Poirot stood at the lich gate of St. Anne, Cuthbert's Church, Ashford Minster, with his umbrella deployed and his expression indicating that the Hertfordshire countryside in March was not his preferred environment, and looked at the churchyard with the focused attention he brought to everything that might, on examination, yield something worth knowing. He had not come here for the churchyard. He had come because of a telephone call received at Whitehaven Mansions 4 days ago from a man named Walter Peel, 63 years old, former county councillor, current chairman of the Ashford Minster Historical Society, and, most relevantly, the person who had been standing in this churchyard on the previous Saturday morning when a grave was opened that should not have been opened, and which contained, when it was opened, something that should not have been there. Walter Peel had been breathless on the telephone. Breathless in the specific way of a man who has been trying to tell a story to several people and has been unable to make them take it seriously, and has arrived at the telephone call to Poirot as his last reasonable option before, as he put it, the whole business disappeared into the official machinery and was never seen again. A grave was opened, Peel had said, for the burial of a recently deceased woman, Agnes Flint, 82, died Tuesday, buried Saturday. A natural death, everyone agreed. But when they opened the ground for Agnes's coffin, the grave that was supposed to be her plot, her own reserved plot, which she had purchased herself 20 years ago, the ground was already disturbed. Recently, within the week, and what they found in the pre-disturbed earth, Monsieur Poirot. This is what the vicar won't discuss, and what the police have filed under they don't know yet, and what the coroner has postponed dealing with until the spring calendar permits. What they found was evidence that something had been placed in that grave and then removed, and that whatever was placed there and whatever was removed is connected to the death of a man in this village 6 months ago, whose death was found to be natural and who I believe was nothing of the kind. Poirot had listened to all of this with his customary patience, and then had asked 3 questions. Who was the man who died 6 months ago? What was the connection to the disturbed grave? And why had Peel not told this to the police? The answer to the 3rd question had been simple. He had. They had listened with the polite inattention of a rural constabulary presented with what appeared to be an elderly man's anxious speculation, and they had filed it, and the filing had been, as far as Peel could determine, permanent. The answers to the first 2 questions had brought Poirot to the lich gate of St. Cuthbert's in the rain. He closed his umbrella, opened it again as the rain intensified, and walked into the churchyard. Walter Peel was exactly as Poirot had constructed him from the telephone call, a compact, energetic man with the purposeful bearing of someone who has spent decades on committees and has developed, through long practice, the particular combination of persistence and courtesy that makes committees function. He was waiting inside the church porch when Poirot arrived, and he shook hands with the warm relief of someone who has been expecting help and is glad to see it. He led Poirot into the church, a Norman building with Victorian additions, the usual English palimpsest of architectural ambition overlaid on architectural ambition across 1,000 years. And they sat in the front pew while rain drummed on the old lead roof and the damp smell of ancient stone rose around. Them, Peel told the story. The man who had died 6 months ago was named Richard Coyne. He had been 58 years old, the owner of Coyne's agricultural supply, which had been in the village for 40 years and had been the economic anchor of Ashford Minster, in the way that agricultural suppliers tend to be anchors in farming communities, reliable, essential, unremarkable, until gone. He had died in September, in his farmhouse on the eastern edge of the village, of what the death certificate described as a cardiac event. He was found by his wife, Diane Coyne, at 7 in the morning. The GP had certified the death. The inquest had confirmed the certificate. "Why do you believe it was not natural?" Poirot asked. Peel leaned forward. He had the quality, Poirot noticed, of a man who has been sitting with a theory long enough that he has stopped being uncertain about it and has arrived at a fixed conviction. This was both useful, the conviction gave him precision in telling it, and to be treated with caution, because convictions, once fixed, resist adjustment. "Richard Coyne was not in poor health," Peel said. "I knew the man for 20 years. He was a walker 5 miles every morning, rain or shine. He ate carefully. He drank moderately. His GP doctor, Sutton, who certified the death, had seen him for a routine check in August, 1 month before he died, and had found nothing significant." He paused. He was also, in the weeks before his death, in the middle of a serious professional dispute. One that had been building for months, and that was, according to my understanding, approaching a resolution that would have destroyed a business arrangement that benefited someone considerably. "Tell me about the dispute." The dispute, as Peel described it, concerned the supply contract between Coyne's Agricultural Supply and a farming consortium called the Minster Valley Cooperative, a collective of 7 farms in the valley, jointly purchasing feed, equipment, and supplies to achieve economies of scale. The cooperative had been Coyne's primary client for 12 years, accounting for roughly 60% of his business. The supply contract was renegotiated every 3 years. It had come up for renegotiation in the summer, and Richard Coyne had discovered, in the course of reviewing the cooperative's accounts that he had access to as part of the contract negotiation, an irregularity. "What irregularity?" Poirot said. "The cooperative's treasurer, a man named Stuart Aldis, who farms the largest holding in the valley, had been, over the previous 3 years, overstating the cooperative's collective purchase costs. The members of the cooperative paid into a shared fund based on their share of purchasing costs. Aldis controlled those costs. And for 3 years, the stated costs had been 10 to 15% higher than the actual costs, with the difference a sum Peel estimated at close to £40,000, going somewhere that was not the cooperative's accounts. And Richard Coyne had found this," Poirot said. "He came to me," Peel said, 6 weeks before he died. He was not agitated. Richard wasn't an agitated man, but focused. He said he had found something in the cooperative accounts that he needed to understand before he acted on it. He had asked me because I have some background in financial administration from my council years. I looked at the figures he brought me. The irregularity was clear. He paused. He had also, I believe, confronted Aldis directly, or been about to, the week before Richard died. I met him on the lane, and he said he was expecting a difficult conversation in the next few days. He said it with the particular manner of a man who has made a decision about something he would rather not have needed to decide. "And then he died," Poirot said. "And then he died. And Aldis was at the funeral, and Aldis wept at the graveside, and Aldis proposed the collection for Richard's family, and 2 months later the cooperative quietly revised its accounting procedures in a manner that its members were told was a routine administrative improvement." Peel's jaw tightened. "And nobody connected it to Richard. Until the grave," Poirot said. "Until the grave," he told it. On the Saturday morning, 5 days ago, the sexton had opened the ground in the churchyard for the burial of Agnes Flint, an elderly village woman, long resident, whose reserved plot was in the older section of the churchyard near the east wall. The sexton, a man named Owen Mace, had found the earth of the plot already disturbed, recently turned within the week, he estimated. He had gone down approximately 18 inches and found the depression in the soil consistent with something having been placed there and then removed. The soil had been repacked, but not perfectly, and the experienced eye of a man who had been opening and closing graves for 30 years had told Owen Mace that this ground had been recently used for something it was not intended for. He had told the vicar. The vicar had told the police. The police had come, examined, photographed, and filed. Nobody had yet explained what had been in the ground. Nobody has yet asked the right person, Poirot said. Who is the right person? Peel said. Poirot looked at the rain on the church windows. That is what I intend to establish, but I will tell you this. A grave is not a random choice as a hiding place. It is chosen because it is unlikely to be disturbed. The disturbing of graves is not done casually, not even in the English countryside. It is chosen because it is accessible to someone who has reason to be in a churchyard without arousing suspicion. And it is chosen because the person who hid what was hidden knew this specific grave would be available, knew it had been purchased and was waiting, and knew when it would finally be needed. Agnes Flint died this week, Peel said slowly. She had been declining for months. Anyone who knew her would have known she was close. Yes, Poirot said. Anyone who knew her would have known that the reserved plot she had purchased 20 years ago was almost ready to be used, which means that whatever was hidden there was hidden on a schedule placed before Agnes's death, to be retrieved before the burial opened the ground and revealed it. He paused. The retrieval happened in time, but the hiding was visible to a man who knew how to read disturbed earth. He looked at Peel. "Take me to Stuart Aldis," he said. The Aldis farm sat at the head of the valley, the largest of the cooperative's 7 holdings, its fields running from the valley floor up into the chalk downs on the north face. It was a working farm of the modern sort, not picturesque, but efficient, the farmhouse substantial and well-maintained, the outbuildings orderly, the machinery evident and good quality. The farm of a man who had been prosperous for long enough to invest in continued prosperity. Stuart Aldis was 52. He was a large man, the specific largeness of someone who has worked outdoors physically for 30 years and has maintained the solidity it produces, with perhaps a little additional weight from the years when the work became management rather than labor. He had a broad, reddish face, blonde hair going to white, and the manner of a man who is entirely comfortable in his own territory and is very slightly less comfortable with unexpected visitors. He received Poirot and Peel in the farm kitchen, the large, warm, slightly untidy kitchen of a working farmhouse, where the kitchen is also the office and the sitting room, and the place where everything happens. His wife, Christine, was present, a thin, quiet woman of similar age who moved around the kitchen with the self-contained efficiency of someone managing a domestic environment that also functions as an administrative center, and who said very little but missed, Poirot suspected, nothing. "Mr. Peel tells me you knew Richard Coyne well," Poirot said. "Known him for 20 years, Aldis said. His voice was the wide, flat vowels of the Hertfordshire countryside, unaffected, practical. "Good man." "Bad loss for the valley," he said it, with the ease of someone who has said it many times. "In the 6 months since Richard's death, and means it the same amount each time, which was either genuine feeling become habitual, through repetition, or a performance so well practiced that it had become indistinguishable from genuine. And the cooperative," Poirot said. "You have been treasurer for how long?" 8 years. "A significant responsibility. Someone has to do it. I have the largest holding, the most administrative experience." It made sense. "The accounts," Poirot said pleasantly. "The collective purchasing accounts, Mr. Coyne, before his death, had been reviewing them in the context of the contract renegotiation. He was a careful man, I understand. Thorough. The slightest adjustment in Aldis's expression, not a change. More the quality of something becoming more firmly fixed in its position. The way a jaw sets when a person makes a small, invisible decision about how to receive a question. "Richard was thorough," he said. "Yes. He raised no concerns with you about the accounts?" "He mentioned he had some questions about cost allocations. We were going to meet in October to go through them." A pause. "He died in September. We never had the meeting." "That is unfortunate," Poirot said. "Because the questions, whatever they were, died with him. The accounts were reviewed by the cooperative's members the following January," Aldis said. "The new auditor found everything in order. The new auditor, Peel said, with a quality in his voice that he was not entirely managing. The auditor agreed upon by the cooperative's members, Aldous said, without looking at Peel. He looked at Poirot. Is there something specific you're investigating, Monsieur Poirot? You've come a long way in bad weather to discuss an old set of accounts. I have come, Poirot said, to discuss a disturbed grave. But accounts are, I find, frequently connected to disturbed graves. It is one of the more surprising patterns of my professional experience. He watched Aldous' face. You know, of course, about the disturbance at St. Cuthbert's. I heard about it. Everyone in the village heard about it. Some business with Agnes Flint's plot, Owen Mace, found the earth had been turned. The police came. And left, Poirot said, without establishing what had been placed in the ground and retrieved in the week before Agnes Flint's burial. I imagine they'll get to it. Yes, Poirot said. I imagine they will, and when they do, he stood, pleasantly, with the unhurried movement of a man who has said what he came to say and is content to let it settle. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Aldous. The kitchen is very warm. He looked at Christine Aldous, who had been standing at the sink with her back to them for the last 5 minutes, very still. It is a pleasure to be warm on a day like this. Christine Aldous turned from the sink. She met Poirot's eyes for a moment, just a moment, and in that moment he saw something that was not the self-contained efficiency he had assessed her as. He saw something specific and careful and afraid. He noted it. He said nothing about it. He put on his hat and went out into the rain. Owen Mace had been St. Cuthbert's sexton for 31 years. He was 68, a short, wiry man with the specific physical competence of someone whose work is never entirely indoor and who has maintained, through decades of practical outdoor labor, a bodily capability that his age had reduced but not eliminated. He met Poirot at the churchyard gate in waterproof clothing that had been waterproof for many years and was now simply water-resistant, and he walked him through the grave section with the particular authority of someone in whose professional domain they were standing. The disturbed plot was in the east section, near the old flint wall, the older graves to one side. The reserved newer plots arranged in orderly rows to the other. Agnes Flint's plot was now occupied. She had been buried on Saturday as planned, the ground closed and mounded, the temporary cross in place. But Owen indicated the precise location with the accuracy of a man who had spent 3 decades knowing exactly where he was in any square foot of this churchyard. Fresh turned, he said. I've been digging graves here since 1963. I know what fresh-turned earth looks like at every season of the year. This was March, fresh within the week. Whoever did it had a good spade and knew what they were doing, and they tried to leave it tidy. But tidy and original are different things. The depth, Poirot said. About 18 inches, maybe 20. Not grave deep, not trying to bury anything permanently. More like putting something in a cool, dark place for a short time. A container of some kind. The compression in the soil suggested a rectangular shape, about the size of Owen held his hands to indicate. A cash tin, or a document box. Flat sides, regular edges. It had been there for some time, the soil had compacted around it. Months, I'd say, not years. And then retrieved within the last week. Within the last fortnight, at most. I was in this section 3 weeks ago to check the drainage after the February floods, and I'd have noticed. So it was retrieved between my inspection and Saturday morning. He paused. Which means someone knew the burial was coming. Yes, Poirot said. Someone knew the burial was coming. He looked at the mounded earth of Agnes Flint's fresh grave. She had been declining. Since Christmas, Owen said. The whole village knew. She was 92, no 82, sharp until the end, but her body had been failing for months. It was a matter of time, and the plot was known to be hers. Everyone in the village knew it. Agnes had bought it herself 20 years ago. She was very organized about it, wanted everything arranged. She showed me the documentation once, years ago. She was proud of having it settled. He paused. Whoever used it as a hiding place knew it was hers, and knew she was dying. and planted something in that ground expecting to have weeks or months to retrieve it before it would be needed. He looked at the grave. They cut it very close. They cut it very close, Poirot agreed, which suggests either that the retrieval was delayed by circumstances or that it was only recently necessary to retrieve it. Something changed. Something made it urgent. Like what? Like Hercule Poirot coming to Ashford Minster, Poirot said quietly. Owen looked at him. Someone knew you were coming, Owen said. Someone in a small village learned, within the last week, that a man named Poirot had been telephoned by Walter Peel. He paused. Small villages are efficient transmitters of information, Mr. Mace. I do not say this critically. It is simply a structural property of communities where everyone is known. The decision to ask for my help, the telephone call, Peel's preparations for my arrival, these would have been visible. In their effects, to people who were paying attention. He looked at the rain on the old wall. And someone was paying attention. Someone who had something in the ground that needed to be out of the ground before I arrived to ask questions about it. Too late, Owen said. Not entirely too late, Poirot said, because the ground still tells us it was there, and because the shape of the thing that was there, that specific rectangular depression, tells us something about what it was, and because the question of what documents, or what cash, or what objects could have been worth hiding in a churchyard grave for months, and worth risking retrieval in the rain 6 months after a man died, that question is answerable. He looked at Owen steadily. And it will be answered. Richard Coyne's wife was living, still, in the farmhouse on the eastern edge of the village where she had found him dead in September. She was 54, a tall, pale woman with the quality that long grief sometimes produces, a kind of worn translucence, as though the usual social density of a person has been diminished by months of sustained loss, leaving something thinner and more direct. She had agreed to see Poirot because Walter Peel had asked her to, and because in the 6 months since Richard's death she had been, by Peel's account, increasingly certain that something was wrong with the official account of how it had happened, and she had not known what to do with that certainty. They sat in the farmhouse kitchen, a different kitchen from Aldis's, smaller, with the warmth of a wood burner and the quiet of a house with only one person living in it. The rain against the window, the ordinary sounds of a house in March. She told it differently from Peel, not the village history and the financial argument, but the domestic history. The husband she had been married to for 27 years. He was a fit man, she said. I know everyone says that when their husband dies of a heart attack. I know it sounds like denial, but Richard's fitness wasn't vanity, wasn't any particular health anxiety. It was just what he was. He walked because he liked walking. He ate well because he liked food. He'd had a medical in August doctor. Sutton had been thorough. Richard liked Sutton, trusted him. Nothing found. Dr. Sutton certified the death, Poirot said. Yes. A pause. I have no reason to doubt Matthew Sutton's competence. He was Richard's doctor for 15 years. He was at the house within 20 minutes of my call, and he was kind. He was very kind. He told me it was quick, that there would have been no suffering, that these things sometimes happen in apparently healthy men. She looked at her hands. I believed him. I had no reason not to believe him. But something changed, Poirot said. 2 months after Richard died, I was going through his papers, his business papers, the things in his study. I needed to understand the financial picture, the business, what would happen to it. And I found... She stopped. I found a notebook. Richard kept a notebook. He always kept them. Little hardback notebooks, 1 per year. He was the kind of man who wrote things down. Not a journal, not personal things. More like a working record. Dates, figures, names, notes on conversations. And the most recent notebook. The entries for the last weeks of his life. I read them. Most of it was routine supply figures, client notes, the contract renegotiation. But in the last 10 days of entries, there was a different quality. The entries became shorter, more guarded, as though he was being careful about what he wrote down, and there were initials instead of names. And one entry, 4 days before he died, that said simply, "Told S.A. today. He knows I know. We'll decide by the week's end." "S.A.?" Poirot said. "Stuart Aldous." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. He had told Aldous he had found the irregularity. He had given Aldous a week to respond. And 5 days later, Richard was dead. "You took this to the police?" "I took it to the police, and they were not unkind. But the notebook was circumstantial," they said. The medical certificate was clear. The inquest had closed. Without evidence of something other than a natural cardiac event, she stopped. "They told me grief sometimes makes us look for explanations, that it was a natural response to loss. They were not entirely wrong," Poirot said. "Grief does sometimes do that, but not always. And your instinct, the notebook, the timing, the connection to a financial fraud that Richard had exposed, these are not the projections of grief. They are observations." He looked at her. "The notebook, where is it?" "In my study," she said. "I've kept it." "I kept everything. May I see it?" She brought it a small hardback notebook, the kind sold in any stationer's, its cover worn with use. Poirot read the relevant entries carefully, moving his lips slightly in the way he did when reading handwriting that required full attention. The entries were as she had described, increasingly careful, increasingly coded, and ending with the final entry on the Friday before Richard's death on the following Wednesday. "Told S.A. today. He knows I know. We'll decide by the week's end." And then, nothing. The next page was blank, and the page after that, and all the remaining pages of the year. "One question," Poirot said. "In the weeks before his death, did Richard speak of keeping documents somewhere safe, of having made a record beyond his notebook something he was protecting?" Diane Coyne looked at him. "He said something," she said slowly. "Once, about a week before he died. He said he had made sure that whatever happened, the numbers would still exist. I thought he meant in the business accounts that the records were backed up, but he may have meant something more literal," Poirot said. "A physical record, documents, somewhere it would not be immediately found." She looked at him for a long moment. "The churchyard," she said. The word came out slowly, as though she were hearing it for the first time and finding its meaning. "The churchyard," Poirot said. Matthew Sutton's practice was in the village surgery on the main street, a converted Victorian cottage that smelled of disinfectant and old carpet, and the particular neutrality of medical spaces that have absorbed decades of other people's distress and learned to hold it without being colored by it. Sutton was 57, a tall, thin man, with the slightly concave posture of someone who has spent 30 years leaning toward seated patients. He had a careful face, the face of a professional whose default mode is listening rather than speaking, and he received Poirot with the polite wariness of a doctor who is being asked about a death he certified and is aware that the asking implies a question about the certification. "Richard Coyne," Poirot said. "The August Medical. What did you find?" "Routine health for a man of his age and profile," Sutton said. "Slightly elevated cholesterol, I advised dietary adjustment. Blood pressure at the upper range of normal, I recommended monitoring. Nothing indicating imminent cardiac risk. And the death. I was called at 7:15 on the Wednesday morning. Richard had been found by his wife at 7. He was in the bedroom. He appeared to have died some hours earlier, during the night. The presentation was consistent with a cardiac event, given his age, the cholesterol reading from the August check, and the absence of any external factors that would suggest anything other than natural causes. I certified the death. You examined him thoroughly. I examined him as thoroughly as a GP certifying a death in normal circumstances examines a patient, without toxicological analysis. A pause. Without toxicological analysis. There was no indication. There would have been no indication if the substance used was one that does not leave the obvious markers, Poirot said. He said it without accusation, without the dramatic weight that would have made Sutton defensive. He said it as a factual observation. Certain substances, cardiac glycosides, administered in precise doses, certain plant alkaloids produce presentations indistinguishable from natural cardiac events in a standard examination. The absence of obvious indicators does not mean the absence of a substance. Sutton was very still. You're suggesting I missed something? I am suggesting that the circumstances did not give you reason to look for it, Poirot said. A fit man found dead. A GP who had seen him 6 weeks before. No apparent reason for suspicion. No crime to investigate. These are not the conditions under which a doctor orders toxicological screening. He paused. But I wonder, Doctor Sutton, whether in retrospect, knowing what you now know about the financial dispute, the timing, the notebook, whether you feel the examination was sufficient. Sutton was quiet for a long time. I have thought about it, he said. I won't pretend I haven't. When Walter Peel came to see me 3 months after the death with the notebook and the financial questions, I thought about it. I went back over my notes from the examination. I asked myself whether I had been thorough enough. He paused. The honest answer is that I performed a standard certification examination in circumstances that appeared straightforward. If someone administered something to Richard Coyne, something that mimics cardiac failure, I would not have found it. Not without specific reason to test for it. And now, Poirot said, the disturbed grave, the suggestion that Richard had hidden documents there, the financial irregularity he had discovered. If I were to ask for an exhumation, Sutton looked at him. The exhumation would need to be ordered by the coroner, which requires a credible reason, which requires evidence, Poirot said, which I am in the process of assembling. He stood. I have one more question. On the day Richard Coyne died, Wednesday, the 17th of September, do you know of any visitors to the farm? Anyone who had been with Richard the previous evening? Sutton was quiet. Something shifted in his face, the specific shift of a man producing a memory he has had and not examined for a while. There was a call, he said slowly. Not to me, I heard it second-hand, from the district nurse who covers the valley. She mentioned, some weeks after the death, in a context I can no longer recall exactly, that she had seen Stuart Aldiss's car at the Coyne farm on the Tuesday evening, the evening before Richard was found. He paused. I thought nothing of it at the time. Neighbors, business colleagues, people visit each other. But given everything else, Poirot said. Given everything else, Sutton said quietly, I have not been comfortable. Her name was Janet Pooley, and she was 44 years old, and she covered a rural district that included Ashford Minster and 4 surrounding villages, and she drove approximately 800 miles a week in a small grey car that knew every pothole on every back lane in the valley. She met Poirot in the village shop, her suggestion, on the grounds that she had 3 calls to make before noon, and the shop was on her route, and she stood in the small back room that served as a staff room, with her coat on and her car keys in her hand, and told Poirot what she had seen on the Tuesday evening in September. She had been coming down the Coyne farm lane at approximately 7:15. She had a patient, an elderly man with mobility difficulties who lived in the cottage at the foot of the lane, and she visited him on Tuesday evenings. As she had come down the lane, she had seen a car parked at the top of the Coyne farm drive, Stuart Aldiss's car, which she knew because she knew Stuart Aldiss's car. She knew everyone's car in this valley. The geography of rural nursing made that kind of knowledge functional. The car was parked at the top of the drive, she said, not in the yard at the top, as though whoever was there had been and was on the point of leaving, or had parked away from the house for some reason. I drove past. I didn't think about it, particularly Stuart and Richard were colleagues in the cooperative. Stuart was often at the Coyne farm for one thing or another. Did you see anyone? Poirot said. Not clearly. The light was going, it was September, about 7 in the evening, so it was dusk. I saw someone moving near the front of the house, a figure. I assumed it was one of them, Richard or Stuart. I drove on to my call. She paused. The next morning, Richard was dead. You gave this information to the police. I gave it to the police when Walter Peel asked me to, about 2 months after the death. They came to me. I told them what I'd told Peel. They wrote it down and thanked me." She looked at Poirot with the direct, slightly impatient gaze of a woman whose professional life had trained her to get to the point. "I'll tell you what I told them. Stuart Aldous was at that farm on the evening before Richard Coyne died. Whether that means anything is not for me to say. But I know what I saw." "Did you tell anyone else?" Poirot said, a fractional hesitation. "I mentioned it to Christine Aldous." Poirot looked at her. "When?" "About 3 weeks ago. She and we're not close friends, but I see her regularly on my rounds. She has an elderly mother-in-law I call on. She asked me once, directly, whether I had seen anything the night Richard died. I told her what I saw. She paused. She thanked me and said nothing more, but she looked like someone who had just been told something they already knew and had been hoping not to hear confirmed. 3 weeks ago, Poirot thought about the churchyard, the retrieval of whatever was hidden in Agnes Flint's grave, the timing. Christine Aldous had confirmed, 3 weeks ago, that Janet Pooley had seen Stuart's car at the farm on the evening before Richard died, and within the following 2 weeks, whatever had been in the grave had been retrieved. Not Stuart Aldous who had removed it. Christine. Poirot went back to the Aldous farm alone, on foot, at 2 in the afternoon, when the rain had eased slightly to the kind of persistent drizzle that the English March considers an improvement. He did not telephone ahead. He did not bring Walter Peel. Stuart Aldis's Land Rover was not in the yard. He was in the upper fields, visible, a small figure on the chalk slope, moving along the field boundary in the grey afternoon. Far enough that he could not be reached quickly, and far enough that he could not see the farm kitchen from where he was. Christine Aldous answered the door. She had known he was coming, not because she had been told, because the specific quality of her stillness when he had been in this kitchen before told Poirot that this was a woman who had been waiting for someone to come and ask her directly, and had been hoping they would hurry. She made tea without being asked. She set it on the kitchen table. She sat down across from Poirot, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for too long and is ready, finally, to put it down regardless of the consequences. "The document box," Poirot said. "From the grave?" "Yes," she said. "Where is it now?" "In the house," she said. I didn't know what to do with it. I retrieved it because I was frightened, but I haven't opened it." "I didn't open it. You were frightened because Janet Pooley confirmed what you already knew, that your husband had been at the Coyne farm on the Tuesday evening." "I had known for months," she said. "I knew when Richard died. Stuart had come home that evening, the Tuesday later than usual, and he was different. I've been married to him for 25 years. I know what different means on his face." She looked at her tea. "I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a dozen explanations. I lived inside those explanations for 6 months." She paused. "And then Walter Peel telephoned Stuart to say that he had contacted Hercule Poirot and that Poirot was coming. And Stuart was very calm about it on the outside. But that evening, after the call, he went to the garden shed for 3 hours and I didn't ask why and he didn't explain. And 2 days later, he told me that a minor matter related to the cooperative accounts had been resolved and there was nothing to worry about." "He told you this?" Poirot said. "He told me this with the specific tone that he uses when he wants me to accept something and not ask about it," she said. "And I went to the churchyard the following night. I had known about the document box. Stuart had mentioned it once, months ago, in the way he mentions things when he wants me to know something indirectly. He said Richard Coyne had kept some documents somewhere, that they would surface eventually and need to be managed. He said it in the way he says things, when he wants me to understand something without him having to say it plainly." "And you understood?" "I understood enough to be afraid." She looked at him directly. "And when I went to the churchyard and found the ground disturbed and the box gone, I understood that Stuart had already retrieved it. So I went back the following evening, and I found, in the loose soil at the bottom of the depression, that there was a second thing, a smaller thing, Stuart had missed it. It had slipped under the box, was pressed against the base of the hole. A small waterproof envelope. I took it. Poirot was very still. "You have it," he said. "I have it," she said. "And the document box, which Stuart left here this morning, I found it in the garden shed while he was in the upper fields." She looked at him steadily. "I haven't opened either of them. I wanted to give them to the right person. I didn't know who the right person was." A pause. "Until you came the first time and asked about the grave, and looked at me when you left." "Bring them," Poirot said. The document box was a standard metal document case, grey, with a combination lock that had been set to a 4-digit number. It had been forced, clumsily, with a screwdriver or similar tool. The lid was slightly bent at the corner. Someone had been inside it. Inside, financial documents. Printouts from accounting software, annotated in a careful hand that Poirot recognized from the notebook entries as Richard Coins. Columns of figures with corrections, comparisons, calculations, 3 years of cooperative accounts, with Richard's annotations identifying the specific discrepancies, the overstatements, the figures that didn't reconcile, the amounts that had been redirected. At the bottom of the stack, a summary document in Richard's hand. Total discrepancy across 36 months, £41,200 approx. Funds transferred from cooperative account at each quarterly settlement to account ending 7,734. Account holder not identified in cooperative records. Account opened in Stuart Aldis's personal banking, confirmed by statement reference obtained from Cooperative Bank on 14 September. Confirmed on the 14th of September. Richard had died on the 17th, 3 days after confirming the identity of the account. The small waterproof envelope from beneath the box contained a single item, a USB drive. Poirot looked at it. He looked at Christine Aldis, who had a laptop computer on the kitchen counter. "May I?" he said. She nodded. The USB drive contained a single audio file. Poirot opened it. It was labeled with a date, 15 September, 2 days before Richard Coyne's death. He played it. The recording was 42 minutes long and was, in quality, the recording of a man who had placed his phone in his shirt pocket or on a surface near him while conducting a conversation he wanted to preserve. The ambient sound was consistent with a kitchen or office. The voices were clear enough to understand. The first voice was Richard Coyne's. Poirot had not heard it before but recognized it from its context, from the direct, methodical quality of the questions it asked. The second voice was Stuart Aldis. The conversation was about the accounts. Richard laid out what he had found with the precision of a man who had prepared this confrontation carefully. The discrepancy. The account number. The confirmation that the redirected funds had gone to an account in Aldis's name. The £41,000 across 3 years. Aldis's responses moved through several stages. Initial denial smooth, professional. The denial of a man who had prepared for this conversation too. Then, as Richard produced the specific account reference he had obtained from the Cooperative's bank, a different quality. Not panic, more calculation. The calculation of a man assessing the strength of what was before him and the options available. And then, at the 31st minute of the recording, Aldis said, "What do you want, Richard? You haven't gone to the police yet. You've come to me. That means you're considering options." And Richard said, "I want the money returned to the cooperative, all of it, and I want your resignation from the committee. And then this is between us and the cooperative, not the police." Aldis said, "Give me a few days." And Richard said, "Until the end of the week." The recording ended there. The end of the week had been a Friday. Richard Coyne had died on the Wednesday. Poirot closed the audio file. He sat for a moment in Christine Aldis's kitchen with the rain against the window and the wood burner breathing its warmth into the room. He looked at Christine. She had been listening to the recording too. She had heard her husband's voice. She had heard the conversation that Richard Coyne had preserved, the conversation that had taken place 2 days before his death, the conversation that established clearly what Richard had found and what he had asked for, and what her husband had been given a deadline to resolve. Her face was very still. You knew, Poirot said, not accusingly, with the quiet of a man acknowledging something that was true. I didn't know this conversation had been recorded, she said. I didn't know the details of what Richard had found. I knew that Stuart had been there, and that Richard had died, and that Stuart came home that night, the Tuesday night, with the quality of a man who had done something he needed to not think about. Her voice was completely steady. I have been living with what that quality might mean for 6 months. And now you know, Poirot said. And now I know. She looked at the laptop. What happens next? I will need to take these to Chief Inspector Japp, Poirot said. He will need the physical documents and the audio file. He will arrange for the necessary legal processes, which will include, I believe, an application for exhumation of Richard Coyne's body, which will need toxicological analysis, which was not performed at the original examination. They'll find something, Christine said. It was not a question. I believe they will, Poirot said, because a man who had been given until Friday and who chose to act on Tuesday, who drove to that farm on Tuesday evening and went inside and spoke to Richard and left that man, brought something with him. Because a conversation on Tuesday was not sufficient. A deadline until Friday had been given in the recording, but a deadline until Friday was too long. Too much could happen. The documents could be copied, the evidence could be forwarded, the recording could be sent somewhere outside the farm before the week was out. He paused. Stuart Aldis needed the deadline not to expire, and so he ended it early. Christine Aldis looked at the window, at the rain on the glass, at the grey afternoon. He is my husband, she said. Yes, Poirot said. He is. A long silence. I'll make more tea, she said. And she stood and went to the kettle and filled it and set it on the hob with the movements of a woman performing the most ordinary domestic act she knows. Because the ordinary domestic act is the only thing, in this moment, that she can fully control. Poirot sat quietly and let her do it. Japp arrived at Ashford Minster the following morning, a Monday, the rain having paused overnight and resumed by 6 with renewed commitment. He drove up from London with a forensic specialist from the county constabulary and an expression of controlled professional focus that Poirot associated with cases that had arrived at the point where the grey cells had done their work, and the institutional machinery was now required to take over. They met at Walter Peel's house, the obvious neutral ground, the house of the man who had started it, whose sitting room now contained Poirot, Japp, Peel, Diane Coyne, Francis Dray, who had driven from London on Poirot's request, and the weather-beaten presence of Janet Pooley, who had reorganized her morning rounds to be there. Poirot laid it out, the document box and its financial records. The audio recording played once, in full, the kitchen ambience and the 2 voices, and Richard Coyne's methodical accounting of what he had found, and the deadline he had given, and the silence at the end of the recording, where the week's end had been promised, and the week's end had not arrived. Janet Pooley's evidence of the car on the Tuesday evening, the notebook entries, the disturbed grave and its retrieved contents, and the small waterproof envelope beneath. Christine Aldis was not present. She had given the documents to Poirot the previous afternoon with the deliberate act of someone transferring a weight, and she had gone, after doing so, to her sister's house in the village, and she had not been back to the farm. Japp listened to all of it without interrupting. He was good at listening when the material was worth listening to, and this material was worth listening to. When Poirot finished, Japp said, "The audio recording. If it's genuine and we'll need to verify it, it establishes the confrontation and the deadline. It doesn't prove the death was caused by Aldis. The exhumation will provide that," Poirot said. "The toxicological analysis should identify the compound used if it was a cardiac glycoside. The tissue will hold evidence of it for months. If it was something else, the pathologist will find it." He paused. Richard Coyne was in excellent health. A man of his profile does not die of cardiac failure at 58 without reason. The reason is in the tissue, if we look for it. "The coroner will need to order the exhumation," Japp said. "The coroner will order it when presented with this material. Dre said, from the corner. He had the specific authority of a solicitor who has been doing things through channels for 30 years and knows exactly how quickly those channels move when the material is sufficient. I can be in front of a judge this afternoon if necessary. The audio recording alone establishes enough to justify the application. Do it, Japp said. He looked at Poirot. The grave in the churchyard. Agnes Flint's plot. Someone knew the plot was used and knew when to retrieve the contents before the burial. You're saying Aldis retrieved the document box, having known about its existence from Richard's notebook or from information gathered after the death and missed the USB drive underneath? He missed the envelope, Poirot said. It had slipped under the box in the ground, pressed against the base. In the dark, in a hurry, in the rain, understandable. He found what he was looking for, and he did not look further. He paused. And Christine found what was left, because Christine, unlike her husband, was not in a hurry. She was simply frightened and thorough. The arrest of Stuart Aldis was made on Monday afternoon, at his farm, in the yard between the house and the upper field, where he had come down from the chalk slope in his working clothes, mud-booted and unhurried. The large man who had been farming this land for 30 years and who walked across his own yard with the easy authority of someone who has never had reason to walk across it any other way. He saw the cars. He saw Japp. He saw the uniformed officers. And he did something that Poirot, standing at the yard gate, noted with interest. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of his own yard in the rain, and he looked at the assembled people, and he did not run, and he did not argue, and he did not perform outrage. He simply stood. The quality of his standing had in it, Poirot thought, the specific weight of a man who has been carrying something for 6 months and has understood, in a single glance at a yard full of police, that the carrying is over. He said nothing when the charge was read. He asked, with the controlled practicality of a farmer asking about a logistics problem, whether there was someone who could feed the stock that evening since his wife was not at the house. The question was answered. He went with the officers without further difficulty. Poirot watched him go. The rain fell. The yard was quiet. The equipment standing in its neat order. The fields rising behind the house to the chalk slope where the sky was doing something complicated with cloud and light. Walter Peel was standing beside Poirot. "I've been trying to do this for 6 months, Peel said. He didn't say it with triumph. He said it with the exhaustion of someone who has been pushing against a wall for a long time and has finally felt it give. "You did it," Poirot said. "You telephoned me. You did the rest." "I followed the threads you had already identified," Poirot said. "The financial dispute, the timing, the disturbed grave. You had assembled the components. I connected them." He paused. The connection required the recording, which Richard had made, and which had been hidden with the documents. Richard Coyne, a careful, thorough man who knew that his own notebook was not sufficient proof, made a recording of the confrontation. He preserved it. He put it somewhere it would survive whatever happened to him. He looked at the yard. He was, in the end, his own best witness. "A man who knew something might happen," Peel said. "A man who gave Aldis a deadline and recorded the conversation giving it," Poirot said. "A man who understood that I know is not evidence and took the steps to make it evidence. The USB drive in the churchyard will be enough with the exhumation and the toxicology to close this permanently." He paused. Richard Coyne, in the 4 days between that recording and his death, did everything a careful man could do to ensure the truth survived him. He deserved better than to need to. But he knew what he was dealing with. Peel looked at the rain on the chalk slope. "The cooperative," he said. "The other members, £40,000 they were owed. That is a matter for the courts and the cooperative's lawyers," Poirot said. "The criminal process will address Aldis. The civil process will address the money." He picked up his umbrella. "I am going back to London," he said. "I have been damp for 3 days and my patent leather requires attention." Peel almost smiled. "Thank you," he said. "Tell me," Poirot said, as he turned toward his car, "how is Mrs. Coyne?" "She rang me this morning," she sounded, Peel considered. She sounded as though she had been told the truth about a thing she had suspected for 6 months and had been told, in the telling, that she had not been wrong. Which is different from how she has sounded for 6 months. He paused. She sounded like herself again. A little. Good, Poirot said. That is the intended result. He walked to his car. The rain followed him in the particular way that March rain follows everyone in the English countryside, without specific hostility, but without any indication that it planned to stop. He walked through the churchyard on the way out. He did this not because it was strictly on the route to where his car was parked, but because the churchyard had been, from the beginning, the center of this, the place where the case had announced itself in the turned earth of a reserved grave, and it seemed appropriate to walk through it once more on the way home. St. Cuthbert's in the rain had the quality of all old English churchyards in wet weather, beautiful in a slightly severe way, the ancient stones made darker and more readable by the wet, the grass very green, the yew trees black and dense at the boundary. Agnes Flint's grave was the newest in this section, its temporary cross white against the older stones. Poirot stood beside it for a moment. He thought about Richard Coyne, who had been buried in this same churchyard in September. He had passed that section on the way in. The grave settled now, the permanent stone in place. He thought about a careful man hiding a document box and a USB drive in the reserved plot of a dying elderly neighbor, knowing that if he was still alive when Agnes Flint died, he would retrieve it and it would never have been needed, and knowing, implicitly, that if he was not still alive, it would be found eventually, by someone, whoever opened the ground. He had not counted on the timing. He had not been able to count on the timing. He could not know when Agnes Flint would die, could not know that she would die quickly enough, that the burial would come within 6 months of his hiding the box. He had placed it there as a long-term insurance, and had not had long enough to need it in the short term. The insurance had paid out eventually. 6 months late, but it had paid out. Poirot looked at the churchyard, at the old stones and the new stones and the yew trees at the boundary and the rain collecting in the carved hollows where the inscriptions were. He thought about what was contained in these grounds, the accumulated fact of a village's dead, century by century, each headstone a name and a date, and the carved shorthand of someone's life. And beneath the surface, the documentary record of one man's careful attempt to ensure that the truth about his own death would be findable. The truth had been in the churchyard all along. Not all along, it had been placed there, deliberately, by a man who understood what truth needed to survive. But it had been there, in the ground, through the winter, through Agnes Flint's final weeks, through 6 months of the village's life proceeding around it, through the rain and the frost and the March thaw, waiting. A USB drive in a waterproof envelope pressed against the base of a depression in the earth of a reserved grave. A small thing, an unremarkable thing, if you held it in your hand without knowing what it contained. Containing everything. Poirot turned up his collar. He adjusted his umbrella. He walked through the lich gate and out onto the lane and toward his car, which was parked near the village shop, and which would take him to the London road and south and home. Behind him, the rain fell on St. Cuthbert's churchyard with the steady, indifferent persistence of water doing what water does, collecting in the hollows, darkening the stones, making the grass more green than it had any right to be in this grey month, falling on the old graves and the new ones and the yew trees and the path and the fresh mound of Agnes Flint's burial plot, without distinction. The rain, Poirot thought, did not know what it had covered and revealed, and covered again in the 6 months since September. The rain had no opinions. It fell and collected and ran off and fell again, and beneath it, the ground kept its records with the patient indifference of earth, which holds everything eventually, and reveals it in its own time. In its own time, or in the time of a man with a magnifying glass and a telephone and the specific, practiced habit of noticing what has changed. He got in the car. He drove south through the green March Hertfordshire countryside in the rain, and the grey cells, which did not rest even in motion, were already settling into the particular quiet of a case that has been resolved completely, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of a thing that has been put in order. The specific satisfaction of order achieved. Not peace, exactly. The world was not peaceful, and the grey cells knew it. Tomorrow, or next week, or next month, there would be another telephone call, another letter, another set of small connected facts that required assembly. But for now, the rain on the windscreen, the road south, the ordered fact of a man brought to account for what he had done, and a woman in a farmhouse somewhere behind him who had found, in the act of giving evidence against her husband, the specific freedom of someone who has chosen truth over safety and has discovered that the choice, however terrible, is the right one. The road opened ahead. The rain fell. Poirot drove home.